I got some classic horror for you guys today. I think you're going to like it. It's The King in Yellow. My hair is a mess today. I was wearing a hat. Can't quite get it right after that. I should put the hat back on. Anyway, today I want to talk about a really important book in the genre of horror and weird fiction. It's by Robert W. Chambers. It was published in 1895, and it's a short story collection called The King in Yellow. This is my Dover edition of it. It collects the original stories plus some additional ones that were published later. Now, there's two interesting things about this book. As a short story collection, I think the stories on their own, with one exception, which I'll talk about in a minute, are not that remarkable. They're kind of typical of what you see in the genre around this time period. Weird fiction, ghost stories. Some of them are not even horror stories. Some of them are romances. Some of them are military stories, things like that. But there's two things that make this book really interesting. One is that there's a use of a linked thread through all the stories, the same device that's used in all the stories to link them together and make them thematically the same. And that is The King in Yellow, which is a play, a fictional play that the author has created that reportedly drives anyone who reads it mad. Now, you get a couple of little quotes from Act 1 at the headings of the stories. You don't get any quotes from Act 2 because Act 2 is supposed to be the part that drives people crazy. It says the banality of Act 1 doesn't prepare them for the crazy occult truths that are listed at in Act 2 that just drive people out of their head. So this is a common thread that runs through all the stories. It's the central plot of some of the stories. It's just tangentially referenced in a couple of the others. But that kind of linking the stories together in this little leitmotif was very influential and kind of unknown at the time. And it particularly influenced H.P. Lovecraft, who did a lot of similar things in his stories. There's a couple of characters that are borrowed from earlier stories. The land of Carcosa and the god Hastur, Robert Chambers steals from Ambrose Bierce, who I'm also reading a collection of his stories at the moment. And then Lovecraft takes those as well and also takes the concept of the King in Yellow and incorporates them into his stories. And he's created this giant mythos about the Cthulhu figures, these elder gods, and set all his stories in the same universe in a similar way to what Chambers did. So that was influential. Another thing that I think makes these stories really unique and interesting is the idea of the unknown, the ambiguity of the stories. Mankind's oldest and most primal fear is the fear of the unknown. You know, what we don't understand, what might be out there is always scarier than what we know concretely. And so with this play, he, very deliberately gives us little snatches of the first act, doesn't give us anything of the second act, doesn't tell us what the play is about. We only get a couple of the characters, just enough to get our imaginations going, and then nothing else. Because obviously, there have been a couple of attempts in real life to write this play and create it and stage it, but I think that's a mistake because nothing anyone can come up with is going to be as scary or as good as what is in the reader's imagination. And so the reader's left with this, just wondering, what is this play about? Who's the titular King in Yellow? What's he doing? What are these characters talking about? What's the play? What are the truths that the play goes into? And you want to read it, you want to find out what it's about, but of course you can't because it doesn't exist. But I think that's a fascinating thing. And then Lovecraft employed the same device in a number of his stories. He had the Music of Eric Zahn, which is about a piece of music, a piece of art that drives people crazy when they hear it because it's so terrible. There's the Pickman's model, which is a similar thing with the sculpture. And then, of course, the Necronomicon, which Lovecraft invented, another book that contains occult truths that will drive people crazy if they read it, this hidden, forbidden book that people have tried to since write and discover. And for a long time, people weren't even sure that he made it up, but he did. So, it's very influential on those genres. All the weird fiction really borrows heavily from Chambers, and I think for that reason alone, this book is worth mentioning. Now, there's one story in particular I want to talk about a little, which is called The Repairer of Reputations, and I think it's a remarkable story. And the main thing I like about it is, again, it plays with this ambiguity aspect because the narrator, it becomes very clear early on in the story, is completely nuts. And many of the characters in the story are completely nuts. And so it takes place 5 minutes into the future. It's in America where, it's become militant and kind of a little bit fascist, very nationalistic. There's military parades. There's state-sponsored suicide chambers all over the place. Kind of a bleak vision of the future not too far from now. But because the narrator is out of his mind, you really have no idea what he's describing, whether it's true or not, or whether it's stuff that he's imagined, if it's delusion. And so you're left with this kind of unsettled feeling when you're reading the story of like, how much of this can I trust? It's the unreliable narrator trope. What of what he's telling me is real, and what of it is his delusion? And I think that's a remarkable story. It's really weird. I think it's really ahead of its time, but it's definitely the centerpiece of the collection in my mind, and by far the one most worth reading. So there you have it. That's The King in Yellow, a classic of weird fiction and horror. I think if you're interested at all in later writers like H.P. Lovecraft, like Algernon Blackwood, like August Derleth, like Arthur Machen, all those guys, if you like that type of fiction, you really owe it to yourself to read this book, because this influenced all of them, and it was just a cornerstone of the genre that got it going. And you had that high point of the genre in the early 20th century when you had all these writers coming up with these great cosmic horror stories that you really don't see much anymore. So I recommend it. I think check it out. Not all the stories are great, but just for influence and uniqueness alone, certainly worth a read. Thanks for watching. I've been Logan Albright. I'll catch you next time.